Now, it is impossible to separate the conversation on the impact of climate change from that of Africa's agricultural sector. Last year's droughts in southern Africa, for example, that was the worst that region had seen in 4 decades. And adverse weather events are getting more frequent and more intense. Let's bring in Enoch Chikaba. He's the Director of Agricultural Delivery Systems at the Gates Foundation, joining us on the program tonight. Thank you for your time this evening. There was an interesting report last week at the Africa Food Systems Summit that pointed out that there's a food affordability crisis on the continent. The cost of a healthy diet exceeds around 60% of median household income. From the supply side, how can we tackle that problem?
No, thank you very much again. Just to mention that Africa is the only region globally where the food insecurity trends are going in the wrong direction. We know that right now 20% of Africans, and to be precise, about 307 million people go to bed hungry. And we know all this is because of the climate change, as you talked about, the El Nino that affected Southern Africa last year. So from the supply side, we have a lot of innovations, the majority of which are ready today if funding is made available. We have innovations in the seed side, and we have climate resilient seeds and livestock breeds that are ready to go. Traditionally, Africa uses about 300 million people in Africa, they depend on maize. And in some places, maize is becoming a major challenge because of the moisture availability. So we are working now on the new varieties of sorghum, of millet, of cassava, some of the already tolerant varieties on the continent. But you find that a lot of the maize that we have today and the wheat and the rice, which have become global foods, it is because there's a lot of research and development that has gone into that. And Africa, unfortunately, for many years, hasn't been focusing on the crops which they call food here. So you tie that to why we have 60% unaffordability of food on the continent. As long as you are not able to produce enough food for yourself, we are going to be importing, and then there's food inflation. So all those things we need to be able to solve them. So we have on the seed side, I think we have a very strong pipeline. We also have some of the digital infrastructure that is ready to come up with innovations that will allow farmers to know precisely what are the soil conditions, and then they'll be able to be planting the right crops at the right season. So we have an avalanche of technology from the seed to the livestock and digital.
So what should countries be doing through the Continental Free Trade Area to put in common SPS standards, right, so that intra-African trade in agriculture can at least help to sort out some of the food affordability problems? Because in part, as you mentioned, it's a structural issue, right? You focused on specific crops, a lot of maize, a lot of rice, and yet there are crops here that we used to rely on, sweet potatoes, cassava, sorghum, millet, that if we scale up production of that, could help to solve part of that affordability problem.
Yeah, the good news is that I'm just coming from Dakar, where we had the African Food Systems Forum, and we got more than 6,000 people attending, including about 39 agricultural ministers. One of the things that are very important under the Kampala Declaration is for Africa to come up with what they call production basins. There are about 8 production basins on the African continent where you can begin to grow these commodities that are suitable for those regions, but they have to be backed up by the trade corridors. And then now utilizing the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, within the CADEP right now, the intra-African trade is only 20%. And by 2035, under the Kampala Declaration, that intra-African trade has to triple, coming to about 60%. So when we have mapped the continent into production basins, which are agroecologically suitable for growing exactly those crops that you talked about, we can grow sorghum, we can grow millet, we can grow cassava, but the fact that you can't grow that throughout the whole continent. So you need to make sure production basins are also coupled with infrastructure and through the corridors. And that's how you can turn around this ambition of tripling intra-African trade through the utilization of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But again, to your point, a lot of the hindrances today that even non-tariff barriers. As you move from one country to another, we need to be standardizing the documentation and the free movement of people and goods, across the African continent.
I want to go back to something you mentioned a little earlier, the question of capital, right? Because in a medium term, just looking across sub-Saharan Africa, at least half of the economies here either at high risk of debt distress or they're already in debt distress, and therefore public funding for extension services, seed research, agricultural infrastructure like irrigation, for example, less than 10% of our arable land is actually being irrigated right now. That funding on paper is going to be fairly limited. To what extent can private sector services help to fill that gap?
Fortunately, agriculture is the private sector. You look at the farmers themselves, they are private sector. You look at a lot of the companies. So the government can play an enabling role, making sure that the incentives for private sector to invest, take away all these trade barriers, make sure that there is a forex remittances, and then allow private sector to come and invest. There are a lot of agro processors, especially as you establish these production basins, and then there's the infrastructure to be moving around the seed. So I think the government can play an enabling role, which is exactly the role of government globally. But then providing those incentives from the private sector so that capital can begin to flow into the continent. I would say maybe that's number one. Number two, also to be making sure that they also comply with some of the objectives of the Kampala Declaration, making sure that only 1% of the agricultural GDP is allocated to research, development, and extension. So if you look at that's 1%, remember the Kampala, coming from Maputo, we went to Malabo, they were talking about 10%. Now, it's not just the amount, the 10%. It is also where the 10% goes. And now it turns out 1% of the agricultural GDP, if it is put in the right areas of research, development, and extension, then you are going to be catalyzing private sector. That will be now delivering the seed, right. And then some will be collecting as traders, and then doing the agro-business and value addition. So the resources should always come from the private sector, but then the public sector plays that enabling environment.
Indeed. We'll have to leave you there for the time being. Enoch Chikawa, Director of Agricultural Delivery Systems at the Gates Foundation, joining us there live on the program. Now, we're still focused on the Africa Climate Summit. Some hours ago, I spoke to Amos Waimanya. He's the Responsive Campaigns Lead at Greenpeace Africa. I started our conversation by asking him what climate policies African countries need to be agreeing on and to push for ahead of the COP30 summit in Brazil.
Yeah, the thing is, the first Africa Climate Summit that was captured through a Nairobi Declaration gave us a map on where we want to go. So this Addis Summit must provide us with actual routes, concrete steps on achieving energy and food sovereignty, protecting our important ecosystems such as the Congo Basin, and respecting indigenous people's rights. So in the first climate summit, we had a lot of ambitions, including African leaders set themselves up to achieving 300 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. But this has faced challenges in the implementation phase. So this Addis Summit needs to provide mechanisms, especially for financing the ambitions that were set out by the African leaders in the first summit that took place in Nairobi. We are looking at clear mechanisms for achieving the much needed climate finance at scale that is able to help Africa to achieve energy sovereignty by investing these resources in the abundant renewable energy that the continent has. Africa has a lot of resources that would make it a global leader in addressing climate challenges. It only needs investment. And this summit must be able to activate and provide and unlock the investment potential that is needed to achieve these successes, to achieve this potential that Africa has, to make sure that the African people have electricity in their homes, to make sure that we have food on our tables, to make sure that our communities are being shielded from climate impacts, especially the droughts and floods that have always been displacing them from their homes, destroying their livelihoods. We have to help them build resilience to these impacts.
There were quite a few sessions today that focused on the topics that you're talking about, right? The energy transition, expanding energy access. And the key thread across all of those is access to affordable capital, right? Because on one hand, public sector balance sheets are fairly constrained. More than half of the economies on the continent either at high risk of debt distress or they're already in debt distress at the moment. So in as much as you want to hit those goals, right, delivering an extra 300 gigawatts of generation capacity by 2030 and making sure that hundreds of millions of people, at least 500 million, who still don't have access to electricity, do get access to electricity. How can we hit both of those goals while lowering our debt levels?
You see, at the moment, it is the ordinary people, you and me, that are footing the climate bill. The thing is, the challenge with climate financing needs to be paid. The climate bill needs to be paid by those that have cost us, that have led us to this climate plunder, and that is the polluters. The fossil fuel industry must be made to pay for the climate bill that is giving to our communities. And this can only be achieved through taxing fossil industry, taxing the super rich that have accumulated wealth on the back of pollution, to be able to help in addressing the climate, the gap that we have in climate financing. So we are hoping that through this summit, African leaders will be able to restate the positions that they have had on tax and climate. And this is supporting the ongoing process on a UN tax convention, where we are going to establish new global tax rules that are inclusive, that are fair, that are democratic, that allows those who have plundered, those who have created this climate destruction to pay for it, and not the ordinary people who are paying for it in forms of lost homes, lost livelihoods, and lost lives.
But we have a climate denier, for example, running the White House at the moment. And, generally speaking, if you look across the West and what happened at COP29 last year, a lot of these countries that bear the burden and responsibility of having put a lot of these polluting gases into the atmosphere, most of them were like, listen, we really don't want to put cash on the table. We really do not want to pay up, as it were, because from their perspective, paying up implies liability. What's going to be different this time round? Because those positions have only hardened in the last 12 months.
The thing is, we are in very challenging multilateral and geopolitical space at the moment, and this gives Africa the chance to step up and be that global leader in providing direction to the world on where we need to go. All of us have seen what our climate crisis is. It is not a far distance thing. We are living a climate catastrophe. Today, we are shuttling between disasters on our continent. If it is not droughts, it is floods. So it is evident that we are living a climate crisis. And Africa has a chance, not just of being a cradle of humankind, but also a cradle of solutions, leading the world in the right direction, leading the world in investing in resilient, in renewable, in sustainable systems that are providing for everyone, and not just a few rich that have accumulated wealth at the expense of the planet, at the expense of our climate, at the expense of our communities.